March 1943. The North Atlantic is a steel graveyard where convoys vanish into the darkness. In just 6 days, 22 merchant ships are swallowed by the sea, hunted by German submarines that strike like ghosts. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't won with eyes, but with ears. Every propeller, every hull plate created a sonic signature that traveled kilometers underwater, an invitation to the wolf pack of U-boats. Their hydrophones were sharpened ears in the darkness, while the Allies' primitive sonar, Aztec, was a beacon that only illuminated forward, leaving the flanks blind. In the corridors of the Admiralty, engineers sought a complex solution. But the most revolutionary answer in naval warfare wouldn't come from a laboratory, but from the noisiest place on a ship, the galley. The hull's own vibration was a death sentence, and time was running out. Far from the war maps and strategy rooms where admirals decided the fate of thousands of men, Tommy Lawson lived his daily life in the throbbing, noisy heart of a merchant ship. His rank was cook, and his universe was the galley, a confined space dominated by the heat of the furnaces, the metallic smell of oil, and above all, the incessant noise of the engine. That constant vibration, propagating through every steel plate, made every dish, every pot, every utensil tremble. For most of the crew, that rumble was an irritating background noise, a necessary evil they tried to ignore to maintain their sanity. But Tommy was different. He didn't ignore the sound, he listened to it. With the sensitivity of a musician hearing a discordant orchestra, he began to notice the subtleties of that mechanical melody. He realized how the hull's hum changed pitch with speed, how the vibration's frequency shifted with the cargo's weight, and even how the wave's mood influenced the ship's voice. To him, that sound told a story, and he patiently learned to decipher its secret language. His curiosity, however, was about to transform into a revelation that would change the course of the war. On a particularly tense crossing, under the constant threat of submarines, a ship in his convoy was struck by a torpedo. As panic set in aboard, with men rushing to the lifeboats and the sound of sirens cutting the air, Tommy, helpless in his galley, watched the wounded ship slowly sink on the horizon. And it was then that he noticed something no one else seemed to register. As seawater flooded the holds and the metallic caverns of the vessel, its characteristic sound diminished. The deafening engine noise, which had once echoed through the entire structure, seemed muffled, swallowed by the mass of water now embracing it. In that moment of disaster and tragedy, an absurd and brilliant idea ignited in his mind. If accidental flooding could silence a ship, perhaps water could be used deliberately as an ally. Perhaps the ocean itself, which served as the enemy's hunting ground, could provide the perfect camouflage. That thought, born of pure observation and devoid of any scientific calculation, was simple, almost childlike, but it contained the kind of raw, effective logic that military science, with all its complexity, had overlooked until then. The cook, unknowingly, had just stumbled upon a principle of acoustic engineering that experts had sought in vain. From that day on, he began his own silent investigation, using his ears as his primary laboratory instrument. He tapped spoons on the floor, pressed his head against metal walls to feel the different resonances, and with his palms measured the deck's vibration. Each new discovery reinforced his revolutionary hypothesis. Water, dense and heavy, could function as a natural filter, an acoustic barrier between the vibration generated by the machinery and the ship's outer hull. Armed with his conviction and notes in a grease-stained notebook, Tommy decided he couldn't keep his discovery to himself. In a war where every lost ship meant fewer lives and vital supplies, silence was a matter of survival. He needed to share his theory. The initial reaction, however, was exactly what one might expect from a battle-hardened crew suspicious of anything outside the norm: disbelief and mockery. In the narrow corridors and wind-swept decks, his idea quickly became a joke. "So you're gonna drown the submarines with a pot of water, Tommy?" his comrades laughed, imagining the cook trying to silence a 10,000-ton steel giant with kitchen tricks. Anecdotes about his madness spread through the ship like wildfire, painting him as a harmless dreamer detached from the harsh reality of war. But Tommy wasn't shaken. The jokes didn't hurt him as much as the constant, treacherous sound of the propellers, a sound he knew was a beacon for death, an open invitation to enemy torpedoes. He persisted, clinging to his conviction with the stubbornness of someone who knows a truth no one else can see. He continued his observations, day after day, filling his notebook with rudimentary drawings of shafts and hulls, and notes on frequencies and vibrations he felt intuitively but couldn't name in technical terms. His insistence, hovering between irritation and curiosity among the crew, eventually reached the ears of the ship's captain. The officer, a pragmatic and overburdened man, summoned him to the bridge, more to satisfy a whim and put an end to the matter than out of genuine belief that a cook could solve the Allied Navy's biggest problem. With the simplicity of someone who masters his craft, Tommy explained his logic. If the most vibrating structural parts were surrounded by a layer of confined water, the sound would have difficulty propagating to the outer hull. Water would act as a damper. The captain listened, skeptical, but something in the quiet conviction and clarity of reasoning from that man made him pause. It was a strange, unorthodox idea, but at its core it possessed undeniable logic. He didn't approve it, but he didn't dismiss it entirely either. In war, he thought, even the silliest ideas deserve a drawer, because you never know when a fool might save a convoy. He noted the theory in a routine report, without much emphasis, and filed it away. For Tommy, it was a small victory. His idea, though still considered impossible and amateurish, hadn't died. It had merely been shelved, waiting for the right moment or the right person to truly hear it. In a world where engineers sought solutions in million-dollar designs and not in a simple puddle of water in a ship's hold. Tommy Lawson's luck, and perhaps that of the entire Allied fleet in the Atlantic, changed when his bizarre theory, archived in a forgotten report, reached the right man at the right time by a stroke of fortune. Commander Peter Gretton was no ordinary officer. He was a legend among British escort groups, one of the Royal Navy's most feared and effective submarine hunters. But what distinguished him wasn't just his decorations, but his philosophy. Gretton was a man of the sea, known for his deep distrust of manuals and his unwavering faith in practical experience gained on the battlefield. He firmly believed that the most important answers to war's challenges wouldn't be found in reports from an office in London, but on a ship's deck, in the midst of a storm, with the smell of salt and the sound of danger in the air. Upon returning from another exhausting and bloody patrol in the Atlantic, he overheard the buzz in the command corridors about the cook who wanted to silence submarines with water. While other officers laughed and dismissed the story as just another sailor's rumor, Gretton's curiosity was immediately piqued. He saw in it a glimpse of unconventional thinking, the kind of creativity born of necessity that is so often crushed by bureaucracy. He summoned Tommy. The meeting that followed was a clash of worlds, a scene straight out of a novel. On one side, the high-ranking officer in his impeccable uniform and aura of authority. On the other, the cook, still carrying the smell of broth and grease on his clothes, nervously clutching his stained notebook. Gretton was direct and straightforward. "Tell me, cook, what exactly do you want to do with my corvette?" Without hesitation, Tommy opened his notebook and, with the clarity of someone who understands the essence of his plan, explained the idea. Create improvised water chambers and use rubber bladders to dampen the vibrations of the propeller shaft and engine mounts, creating a cocoon of silence around the noise source. Gretton listened attentively and then asked the crucial question, testing the courage of the man before him. "And if it breaks the shaft?" Tommy's response was immediate, firm, and sealed his fate. Better to break the shaft than to break the ship. A subtle smile crossed the commander's face. He recognized in that phrase not just bravery, but the relentless, pragmatic logic of war. Gretton immediately called his chief engineers and ordered them to assess the feasibility of that amateur plan. The expert's verdict was predictably skeptical and disdainful. "It's possible, sir, but it's amateur work. It's crude." Gretton's response was curt, definitive, and entered the unofficial history of the Navy. "Then do the amateur's work." The decision was made. In that moment, without fanfare or ceremony, the British Navy, by order of one of its most respected commanders, had just authorized one of the most unusual and revolutionary tests of the Battle of the Atlantic, betting the safety of a warship and its crew on the intuition of a man whose only responsibility until then had been to cook for them. The ship chosen for Gretton's bold experiment was HMS Sunflower, a Flower-class corvette. These corvettes were the workhorses of convoy escorts, small, tough, and mass-produced for a war of attrition. They were, in Gretton's own words, strong enough to withstand strange ideas. Tommy Lawson was brought aboard not as an inventor, but under the official guise of technical assistant, a formality to keep the project secret and avoid the panic or ridicule such an experiment might cause. For Tommy, that mission was like preparing the most complex and risky dish of his life, where the main ingredient was silence, and the slightest error could be fatal. The work began in a desperate race against time, an exercise in pure improvisation at sea. There were no blueprints, no purpose-built parts. Everything had to be created from what was available. The engineering team, following Tommy's intuitive guidelines, adapted empty fuel drums, cutting and welding them around the propeller shaft tunnel to create the water chambers. They used old valves from other systems, canvas hoses, and sealed the joints with rubber blankets and thick layers of grease. The process was artisanal, crude, almost a hack job, but it had a clear and audacious purpose: to deceive the enemy's ears. The other sailors, not involved in the project, watched with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, most convinced it would end in disaster. The first test confirmed their worst fears. It was complete chaos. As soon as the valves were opened, water gushed from the poorly soldered seams, hoses burst under pressure, and the engine compartment turned into a slippery, dangerous pool. Gretton, soaked and visibly frustrated, was about to abort the mission. But Tommy, with the unshakable calm of someone who trusts his recipe, asked for one more night. He argued that the principles were correct, it was only the execution that had failed. The team, inspired by his tenacity, worked relentlessly through the night, reinforcing every joint, tightening every bolt, using more canvas and more grease. At dawn, exhausted but determined, they tried again. This time, when the water filled the chambers, the ship shuddered for a moment, and then a strange, almost supernatural silence settled in. The deafening engine noise, the constant vibration that rattled everyone's bones aboard, had dissipated. It felt as if the ship was breathing at another frequency, lower, softer. Gretton, incredulous, ordered the engineer to increase the RPM, first to half speed, then full ahead. The result held. The hull was nearly mute. For the first time since it had been launched, the Sunflower seemed to glide over the water in secret. The improbable not only worked, it exceeded all imaginable expectations. The cook's hack was, in fact, a stroke of genius. The resounding success aboard HMS Sunflower was promising, a glimmer of hope amid the Atlantic's carnage. But a controlled test on a single warship wasn't enough. The true trial by fire for Tommy's invention would have to be on the battlefield, in the midst of a convoy, under real attack. Gretton, aware of the discovery's importance, sent a cautious but firm report to the Admiralty. He described the phenomenon as a significant reduction in hull-radiated noise, deliberately avoiding mention of the cook to avoid discrediting the discovery. Intrigued and desperate for any advantage, the command authorized a larger-scale test, but with maximum discretion. The perfect opportunity arose with convoy ON-184, a motley fleet of merchant ships preparing for the dangerous crossing from Liverpool to North America. Secretly, under cover of night, 6 of the convoy's merchant ships were equipped with Tommy's system. The work was done hastily, in dimly lit docks, a clandestine operation of welding, adaptation, and improvisation, far from curious eyes. Tommy, now elevated to unofficial technical consultant status, supervised each installation, ensuring his simple but precise idea was replicated correctly on every ship. When the convoy sailed, the Kriegsmarine's U-boat Wolfpack, informed by their spies, was already waiting, positioned on interception routes, ready for what they expected to be another easy massacre. The German hydrophone operators, the ears of the submarine fleet, tuned in, ready to detect the familiar music of propellers and engines that would indicate position, speed, and number of targets. But this time, something was terribly wrong. The readings on their equipment were confusing, intermittent, illogical. The characteristic sound of some ships blared strongly in their headphones and then suddenly vanished completely, as if the ocean had swallowed them for moments, only to reappear elsewhere. The submarine commanders, frustrated and confused, began reporting over their radios the presence of ghost echoes and intermittent noises. It was an acoustic nightmare that defied their experience and technology. Without a clear, constant sonic signature, it was impossible to accurately calculate distance, angle, and speed for a shore torpedo shot. They lost precious minutes, eternities in submarine warfare, trying to relocate targets, doubting their own senses, biting at empty darkness. The attack eventually happened, and it was brutal. 9 ships in the convoy were hit and sunk. But when the sun rose and the smoke cleared, the result of the secret experiment was undeniable and astonishing. None of the 6 modified ships had suffered a single scratch. They had sailed through the heart of the attack like ghosts. Gretton, from the bridge of his escort ship, sent a short, powerful message to command. Recommend widespread and immediate adoption. The response from Admiral Max Horton, the brain behind the anti-submarine war, was equally concise and laden with historical significance. Proceed quietly. A cook's idea had just become the Allies' newest and most secret weapon. Horton's order, proceed quietly, unleashed a secret operation of unprecedented scale and speed in naval history. Tommy's invention, now baptized with the technical and anonymous name of field acoustic insulation for official reports, but still fondly known on the decks as the cook's trick, began to be installed on dozens, then hundreds of merchant and escort ships across the United Kingdom. The docks worked night and day in a race against time. Tommy Lawson, the man behind it all, traveled from port to port, not as a celebrated hero, but as a shadowy, anonymous figure, a consultant who taught seasoned engineers and sailors to listen to their own ships, identify their noise sources, and most importantly, silence them. The effect of this silent campaign on the Atlantic theater was seismic, a tectonic shift in the balance of power that the enemy only felt when it was too late. On the German side, U-boat commanders' reports, once triumphant, became increasingly confused, frustrated, and finally desperate. They reported the inexplicable existence of silent zones in the middle of the ocean, vast areas where entire convoys seemed to disappear completely from their hydrophones, turning what was once methodical hunting into a frustrating and dangerous game of guesswork. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the cunning and relentless commander of the submarine fleet, demanded explanations that his best engineers and scientists couldn't provide. Theories ranged from thermal anomalies and ocean currents to new forms of magnetic interference. No one suspected that the truth was so simple and at the same time so ingenious. The ocean, their greatest acoustic ally, the medium that carried the sound of their prey straight to their ears, had learned to lie. The mass attacks, once synonymous with guaranteed success, began to fail at an alarming rate. The sea wolves no longer hear the herd and, hunting blind, expose themselves dangerously to the increasingly coordinated and deadly Allied counterattacks, which now benefited from better air cover and new radar systems. The climax of this dramatic and invisible turning point occurred in May 1943. That month would forever be etched in fiery letters in German naval history as Black May. In a single month, 41 German submarines were confirmed sunk, a catastrophic and unsustainable loss that broke the backbone of the U-boat force. The weapon that had nearly brought Britain to its knees, that threatened to sever its vital lifeline with America, had lost its deadliest advantage: surprise. The invisible war of sounds, which the Germans had initiated and dominated, turned brutally against them. The hunters, now deaf and disoriented, became the hunted. When the war finally ended and peace returned to the seas, Thomas Lawson returned to anonymity with the same naturalness and humility with which he had entered history. His name was never published in newspapers, no medal was pinned to his chest, no mention was made in victory speeches. He simply resumed his life, continuing to work as a cook on merchant ships that now crossed a much safer Atlantic, in part thanks to him. His reward wasn't fame or fortune, but the quiet, personal satisfaction of sometimes pressing his ear to a ship's hull and hearing a softer, almost grateful hum, a sound that to him meant lives saved. However, if the man was forgotten by official records, his idea survived and flourished in ways he could never have imagined. The improvised hack aboard HMS Sunflower became the progenitor of a new era in naval technology. In the Cold War years, when the cat-and-mouse game between submarines and surface ships became even more sophisticated, navies around the world developed complex systems like Prairie for propellers and Masker for hulls. These systems, which pump air or bubbles around a ship's noisiest parts to create an acoustic barrier, are the direct and technological evolution of that fundamental principle intuited by a cook with his ear, using a fluid to mask sound and deceive the enemy. Tommy's legacy isn't in history books, therefore, but in the very engineering of every modern warship that plies the oceans in relative silence. His personal story, stripped of documentary proof, has become a deck legend, a powerful myth whispered in port bars from Liverpool to Halifax, the tale of the cook who fooled the Germans' ears with a pot of water. Today, where fact ends and legend begins, no longer matters. What endures is the immortal symbol of his story, the inspiring proof that attentive observation, relentless curiosity, and the courage to challenge common sense can be more powerful than any weapon. Tommy Lawson taught the world a fundamental and timeless lesson. The greatest revolutions don't necessarily arise from grand plans or recognized geniuses, but sometimes from a simple whisper of truth amid the deafening noise of war. His true and enduring legacy is, ironically, silence itself.